Okay, I guess I'm up. Coach, thank you for the presentation. That was awesome. Latasha, thank you. And Ethan, even though he's not here, for hosting or sponsoring. Frank for hosting and his staff. That's awesome. So it's good to be here. I thought about what to talk about, and Coach talked about the path he took over time. So what I'm going to talk a little bit about is kind of a little bit of my path, but what's become popular now has been the reconditioning role, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well as modifying exercises so you can keep your injured athletes trained. Does that make some sense? So I started out in sports medicine I graduated in 1983, and my first job was at a high school in California. And when I get done with football season, the coach says to me, "Hey, can you help me in the weight room?" I said, "Absolutely." I'm 21 years old, and I go in the weight room, and I absolutely don't know anything what I'm doing. So when I went to grad school 2 years later, I was a grad student in sports medicine, but one of my rotations was in the weight room at the University of Virginia, so I got to spend that whole off season with them, and that's when I started to blend both together. I got to Delaware in 1988, and I was head strength and conditioning coach at the University of Delaware for 23 sports by myself. I was also the head athletic trainer for men's basketball. I also taught in sports medicine, and I taught in the exercise science curriculum, and I actually wrote the strength and conditioning minor curriculum as part of that process. I got to teach anatomy and physiology for 17 years, and kinesiology, cadaver anatomy labs. So along those lines, it's really helped me as a strength coach make specific decisions. With that being said, I was training sports I was never involved with as a youth. I got field hockey, I got tennis, I got this. I grew up in a small coal mining town. So, yeah, football, basketball, baseball, wrestling, and track. I'm sure we had the other sports, but I didn't know enough about it. So I'm going to these coaches, "Hey, tell me about field hockey." Coach mentioned the energy systems, etc. But the biggest thing I want to say is this. I in no way have invented anything. I'm a student of this for life. I want to thank my mentors who were primarily my biggest inspiration. So I've been what I call a student to Coach Johnny Parker since 1990, Rob Panarillo since 1991, and Al Miller since 1994. I was telling Coach Galt that I spoke with Johnny last night on the phone. I've been to his home in New England, his home in Tampa. I've stayed with him on numerous occasions. And, I just can't thank the people who have taught me over the years. And to me, that's important. But what I'm going at here is, it led me to study demands of the game. Okay? An example I'll give, when I was at Delaware, the basketball court's 94 feet. We did nothing longer than maybe 2 lengths of the court. A lot of it was change of direction, etc. And when we hired Mike Bray, I didn't hire him, but when Delaware hired Mike Bray before he went to Notre Dame, he came up to me and he said, "The one thing I like to do is the day before we start practice is I like to gut check the players in a mile run." And I said, "Well, Coach, I don't train anything." He goes, "I don't want you to change anything. This is just something I like to do. It's once a year." I said, "All right, go ahead." Our biggest center was 6'11", 252, and he ran a 5'30". And our 2 point guards ran a 4'41", and everybody else was in between. And we never trained longer than 2 lengths of a basketball court. So again, I think there's some carryover there. But as I studied games and I looked at, 38% of basketball is vertical displacement, but only 8% of that is max displacement. So when I'm looking at implementing plyos, am I going to do max plyos, or am I more into the repetitive, quick, reactive plyos, so to speak? I also rely a lot on Al Vermeil's hierarchy of strength, if you're familiar with that. So work capacity, develop strength, develop power, develop speed, and then finally develop elasticity. But how does that play into bridging the gap? So I was doing some research, and Rob Panarillo does a lot of this research, and one of his slides he recently put out, and this got to me because I made these mistakes early in my career. But if you're doing rehab and you're doing 3 sets of 10 in rehab, which is fairly common in the early phases of rehab, in the remodeling phase. But if you're doing 3 sets of 10 3 times a week and you add that up over a year, you're doing about 46,000 total reps. If you do it twice a week, you're doing about 33,000 total reps, where our Olympic weightlifters who are healthy and elite are only doing 25,000. So that leads to the overtraining. And they were the mistakes I was making. Well, that's when I started to study with Coach Parker and Coach Miller and those guys, the system and volume control. Okay, because we overtrain 3 different ways: mental, emotional, and physical. Physical is the last one. And then I started to study when I throw a baseball, my arm is decelerating at 7,000 to 9,000 degrees per second. So how can I train there and not tear up what's called the avascular zone of the throwing shoulder? So, for example, the rotator cuff is not a complete cuff. Okay, and I asked Coach Lasante for a dry erase board, so I'm going to draw you a quick picture here as we go. So if you take a look at, and this is what's helped me make decisions over the years. So if I draw the shoulder, there's the acromion process, and there's the clavicle. And here's your coracoid process. So we're going back to a little bit of anatomy. Well, you've got 2 ligaments here, the conoid and trapezoid. Then you got the AC ligament. Okay, then you got the long head of the biceps. Then you've got the short head of the biceps. And you've got your deltoid. Then underneath is your rotator cuff. So there's 3 in the back. Okay, and there's 1 here. That's not a complete cuff without that ligament. That's your coracohumeral ligament. Okay, and so what happens if you take a wet rag and you wring it out with water? That's what's happening to that blood supply up there every time we're doing stuff overhead. But the argument comes, well, maybe we shouldn't train overhead, but sport demands that you train overhead. So that's where your volume of control comes in calculating how much exposure you're going to get. And we overtrain more through the volume, multiplying sets and reps, than we do with intensity. And people fail to think this way. And I want you to hear this clearly. If I'm training at 95% of a max, I'm still sub-maximal. Unless I hit 100%, I'm still training sub-maximal. So your volume of work or your exposures is what you need to look at to prevent some type of overtraining and keep them healthy. So I get to Virginia, and I give credit to Ethan Saliba, was the head athletic trainer for football at the time. And I go into Ethan, this is 1998, and I knew Ethan before. I did my master's at UVA. But when I went back as director of strength, I went into Ethan and I said, Ethan, if I come in here, I can talk to you about a Bankart procedure. I can talk to you about ACL reconstruction and rehabilitation. I said, but you're going to make a decision if a kid can or cannot do a lift. I said, what's a snatch? What's a jerk balance? What's a heave balance? What's a snatch balance? What's this exercise? What's that exercise? And he goes, well, I'm not really sure. I said, well, how can you make a decision if the kid can or cannot do this? So to his credit, he took out of his budget and he paid for the athletic trainers with football to do the USAW course so we can communicate on smart decisions. Okay? I'm going to talk a little bit about simple decisions you can make without getting really in depth with that. And how we bridge that gap, because too many people want to butt heads. And think about this. Strength coaches don't want to be athletic trainers, and the trainers don't want to be strength coaches. But in many places, what I've found over the years is strength coaches want to get too involved with rehab, And trainers want to say too much about strength training, and that's where the headbutting comes in. Okay, because unless we understand the biological healing process, if we don't understand that, then how do you make decisions on what you can and can't do? At what joint angle during the squat is the hamstring most active? How can I get the hamstring 65 to 70% the strength of our quads? We got 4 quads plus the sartorius. So you got 5 muscles in the front of your body, front of your thigh. You got 3 back here. So how do you develop that co-contraction to prevent anterior shearing or that sliding of that tibia forward on the femur? Well, that comes with your program design. That comes with putting this together. If I'm squatting 500 pounds, what's 70% of 500? 385, 365, something like that? Well, I need to be able to RDL something along those lines. But that's just strength balance. So you got 17 different muscles that cross this shoulder girdle complex and act upon that. Down here, it's easy. I got a ratio. Here, I got push to press. So one of the rules I follow is 2 to 3 pulling motions to every one pressing, because if I develop a round shoulder posture and I get a flex neck posture, that head of the humerus rotates closer in. Now I'm really in danger overhead. Or why a neutral grip versus this grip? Because this grip is going to put excessive stress on your anterior inferior glenohumeral ligament, which is the ligament that helps prevent dislocations. That's the position of dislocating. What if I have a slap lesion, which is posterior shoulder, versus Bankart, which is anterior, so shoulder? I'll jump in anytime if I'm off track here. But so these are the things that are important, because what you also see is the injured athlete kind of gets separated from the team. Now they're over there doing their stuff. How do you keep them mainstreamed in? And I think that's very, very important. We had a kid come into Virginia one time, and he's got this walking boot, ankle injury. Hey, Coach, I guess I can't squat today. I said, well, you're squatting today. I'm not going to squat him in a boot. I put a pad on the floor, put him on his knees, and he squatted off his knees. I still got the butt involved, still got the back involved, the glutes, the upper hams. I just took him off his feet. And he's rolling his eyes going, man, you can't get out of squatting him anywhere. So, but you got to be able to do that with the communication of the sports medicine staff. I couldn't make that decision. I would be in the wrong if I made that decision. But if I can go in there and say, are you comfortable with this? And they don't have to know the lift precisely. Hey, this, there's your snatch. Can they do that type of motion? I said to a young coach recently, I said, okay, if someone's doing a clean, and I kind of get rambling though, but if someone's doing a clean and that bar gets away from the body, that's easy to see. And we talk about supervision. The eye of the coach is critical. Okay, but give me 4 or 5 reasons why it got away from the body, because that's what you got to fix. Okay, are the elbows in line with the bar? Am I getting to the balls of my feet too early? Am I starting my pull too early? Am I doing a non-vertical displacement? So any of those things could be the reason that bar drifts. Well, how do you fix that? You got to know why it's drifting, not just that it drifted. Okay? So that makes some sense to me too. So I'm going to give you a couple things here, and we'll kind of go as we go, but I'm kind of going back to the way I used to teach. You know, I just like to have discussions. So if there's any questions, please ask. If I'm dealing with anterior shoulder issues, here's 2 guidelines to follow. Avoid the high 5 position, okay, and avoid wider grip pressing. Bring them in here. Okay, if I'm dealing with posterior, take them wider, because now that's pushing the head of the humerus into the glenoid fossa. So simple things like that you can take to the athletic trainer and discuss, would this be okay? And at the end of the day, it's the physician's call if they have seen the physician. If they haven't seen the physician, it's the call of the athletic trainer. But if you can communicate those things and say, let me show you what this lift looks like, and then we together can make a decision, because at the end of the day, if it's not for the best interest of the athlete, what's it all about? It's not about any of us getting the credit. It's about what's in the best interest of that athlete. Can they do a quarter squat at so many weeks post-op ACL? And what's the depth that you're going to allow them to go at week 6 or 8 versus week 12 versus week 16? It said, when can I start the pulling motion versus the catch motion? Those things all become critical to their development, because compressive forces actually give the joint some stability. But we have to stay out of certain ranges of motion to prevent any shearing type things. And that becomes critical. I've seen people where a lineman tweaks a hamstring and a receiver tweaks a hamstring, and their progressions back to play are exactly the same, where their position demands are not. So why would I take this receiver and lineman and do the same running progression back? Talked to someone recently and I said this. They said to me, hey, so-and-so's running at 80%. I said, are they? They said, yeah. I said, that's great. I said, what's their 40 times? Well, I don't know. Well, how do you know they're at 80% then? And it's little things like that. And some people get a little bit defensive, but at the same time, we got to be accurate, because if we're going to get them back to play. And here's an analogy I heard from Rob Pannarillo, and it makes a lot of sense. If I'm a baseball pitcher throwing 94 miles an hour, and I hurt my rotator cuff, and I go through rehab, and I have full strength, no pain, full range of motion, but I'm only throwing 85, am I ready to play? No, because you're going to get spanked. You're not back to the standard or the demand of that game. So all the clinical stuff says, yes, they're cleared. They're cleared to return to training to get back to the pre-injury level to play. And that's where the gap comes, I think, sometimes. Oh, you're clear, full range of motion, full strength, full this. If I hurt my knee and I have full strength, but my 40 is not what it should be when I was healthy, I'm not ready to go out there. And those are the things I think that really mean a lot if we're going to put them safely back into competition. So I'm going to look at a couple things that I've studied over years with different sports. Coach talked about football as a 5-second sport. But now with the spread offenses, I don't know that you get a minute or a minute and a half. They're running plays every 22 seconds. So what do you do with recovery in between sets now? It's a little bit different with the spread offenses, and you got to defend that spread offense. It's no huddle, hurry up. So that energy system is that. In soccer, you're going to average a 10 to 60 yard sprint once every 47 seconds. Okay, it's not a purely endurance. The rest of the time it's walk jog. Basketball's 53 or 56% live activity, 33% walk jog, and about 11% where you're not doing a whole lot. 20-second timeout, foul shot, reference to the scorer's table for something. So how do you match that energy system? You kind of follow me on some of this stuff? Okay, so, one thing, when I was at Coastal and I was talking to the volleyball coach one time, now he was the former national coach for a Hungarian team, and then he was at Auburn and somewhere else, and he came to Coastal. But he had a degree in exercise science, and I had some great talks with him. I really enjoyed it. And I didn't know, frontline players are going to average maybe 160 to 180 jumps in a 5-set match, where backline maybe 80 to 120 jumps, something along those lines. So how much plyo work do I need to do with them to prep them for that demand of that game in a 5-set match? So that bridging of the gap, to me, becomes a team effort. You know, I look today, I've been in this a long time, so I mentioned 1983 when I started, but now we got all the metric stuff. We got force plates, we got Nordic machines, we got perch units, speed, all that stuff. Well, we didn't have all that back then. And I think at some times we get to the point where we're training to do good on that rather than train to meet the demands of the sport. That gives good feedback. If I'm doing a Nordic test and I'm more than 10% or 8% discrepancy, that's a red flag. It doesn't mean you don't train them. It means you try to bridge that gap a little bit. Okay? And little things matter. Little things matter. I've seen guys go up to do an RDL and their stance is off a little bit, or they're a little bit too wide. Now you're getting more adductor work, not enough hamstring work. So those things become critical too. And it's important to have that coaching eye. To me, I average probably 6 to 8 miles. When football's lifting, I run 3 groups throughout the day, small groups, because I want eyes on them. But I probably walk close to 6 miles in that day, just up and down the weight room. And not all feedback has to be corrective, because some guys do stuff pretty good and say, that's what we're looking for. And then this person, check your stance, you're off a little bit. Take a peek, get reset, and go. You know what I mean? So you give that feedback. So what I've done over the years, I've taken the teaching progressions of, and how many USAWs we got in here certified? So I've taken those progressions, and that's how I've made my modifications. Okay, so in the snatch progression, you've got the overhead squat, and you got the press balance, then you got the heave balance, then you got the snatch balance with footwork. Okay, so what of those progressions can I do? Well, we don't want them in the high 5 position. Okay, then let's eliminate the receiving of the bar and just go to the pulling motion of the bar. That's not going to affect an anterior bank arc. Now, at a certain point, they're going to be allowed to snatch again. If someone's flexible enough, can they do a narrow grip snatch? That's a question to ask as well. And all the questions are doing is this: it's opening the lines of communication so you can make the best decision for that athlete. So you can properly train them and not put them at risk and diminish biological healing. We had a kid at Delaware years ago, and he was a 4.36 guy, and he hurt his knee, ACL, his senior year, had surgery on October 15th. I'll never forget it. 6 months to that day was our pro day. 6 months. And the scouts timed him at a 4.36. Now, this is something that had to go through the physician. I said, Doc, this kid's not a slow twitch player. I don't want him jogging laps, none of that stuff. I want him running 70 to 80% straight ahead. So what's contraindicated to that is rapid stopping and pivoting. So if we're running 60 yards, he's got to have 60 yards to slow down. But I want him at 80%. I want him moving. I want him squatting week 2. Now we're not going deep, and we'll work our depth over a progression of time. And I might not have handled it that way if the guy didn't have to run in 6 months. But the physician was okay with that. And we really pushed the rehab probably faster because he had darts in the meniscus too. And when do they reabsorb? They reabsorb at 6 months. And that's when you get general effusion. So when he was done running, he took a break for 2 weeks and then kind of got back home. But he got into camp with the Jets in Tampa. He ended up playing in NFL Europe back then. But without those lines of communication, without going in there and saying, is this okay? Here's the contraindications. Here's what's okay. Are you comfortable with me implementing this? And now you're building trust with each department instead of this is my call, not it's about the discussions. And I really want to emphasize that because I sat in both of those chairs and I've actually sat in dual roles there. And whose call is this? And it's hard sometimes because I'll hear strength coaches say, well, they should be able to do this. Well, let's talk about that. They're saying no, you're saying yes. Well, where's the medium ground here to make this decision? Why can they squat at 15 or 20 degrees, but they can't get deeper? Here's why. Here's where this surgery is going to be stressed. But at 15 to 20 degrees, I'm dispersing enough synovial fluid throughout the joint for lubrication and help healing. Or what about straight ahead and we want to take the rotation out of that screw home mechanism where the knee locks? In today's world, that role of reconditioning is becoming more and more important. And you see teams hiring that position where they have this area of expertise in both and they can bridge that gap. Because as we go, we want to make sure we could put our athletes in the safest position to return to play. Teaching progressions of the clean. Obviously, it's the front squat and rack first. And then we work from the top down, as I was taught. Okay, the shorter you move the bar, the less complicated it is. And if you do, I don't do our guys I've never done anybody from the floor. We're strictly hang, but that's just me. Because we're gonna back squat deep. We're gonna RDL heavy. So to preserve wear and tear on the back, we're going to do a ton of hypers, a ton of reverse hypers, a ton of scissor hypers. We're going to do all that stuff. Not at Cornell. No, I'm kidding. It reminds me though, years ago I was coaching at Delaware and a buddy of mine was in the same conference. I got to tell this story. So great guy, I love him to death, and he denies this. But I called him up one day and I said, so I'm not going to say his name. I said, Coach, what's going on? Just want to check in and say hi. So everything's good. I go, you doing anything unique this year? He goes, I can't tell you. We're in the same conference. I said, whoever has better players and whoever plays better that day is going to probably win. So, and then I had another coach call me one time. We beat their team 34-14, and on a Saturday, he calls me Monday morning and he goes, Coach, my coach wants to know how many guys bench 400 on your team. I said 0. I said, but ask your coach about the 2 fumbles, the block punt, and the 2 interceptions. He goes, I said, no, don't do that. You'll get yourself fired. But so anyway, I'm getting off track there. But to me, it's important because that's kind of the accidental path I took over time to get there. And as I see how this is evolving, it's important to me that teamwork effort comes together. And and at the end of the day, the athlete's getting the best care for them. Because I've had trainers say, well, they shouldn't do this. Well, why not? And I've had strength coaches saying in rehab, well, they should do, well, you're not the rehab expert. How many of you are just strength coaches here? How many of you have rehabbed an ACL day 1 post-surgery on? Well, you're a dual, so put your hand down, Paul. Okay? So what makes us an expert at rehab? And the trainers here, right? How many trainers have actually, I know you did, but how many trainers have written a 12-week program? You know what I mean? Not often. So that's where you got to bridge that gap. And that's where those lines of communication are critical. And it's really important. If I put something in, it gives me the ability to take something out. So I'm not just adding as I go and piling on and piling on. And that started with rehab years ago. We would do this, oh, I feel great. Day 2, oh, I feel great. Day 3, I feel great. Let's add. And day 4, they're puffed up. So what do I got to do anyway? Now I got to give them a day or two of pure recovery. I never built that in. So as I started to get more involved with the volume side of things, that really helped me in terms of keeping me healthy athletes. The other thing I'll do is, here's another example. So we're training just to make it easy. Typically, like at Virginia, this was our schedule. And then week 2, week 3, week 4, and then week 5 I would train Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday and give them a 4-day break. So I called that a short week. And the reason I did that, physiological adaptation is every 4 to 6 weeks. So at week 5, I would take a full training day away. I didn't have to alter intensity. Intensity is not the issue, volume is. So by taking a whole day away, my volume dropped that week. I can still keep the intensity where I wanted it, okay? And they had a 4-day break before I would start the next phase. And that worked very well too. Some people will stay 4 days and just deload them each day, and that's okay too. That's a coach's choice. The other thing I'll look at is, are you familiar with the physiological zones of training? So I'll work off of that. So if I'm at 0 to 49%, I'm teaching. 50 to 59 is warm up. 60 to 69 is what I call reinforcement of technique. 70 to 79 is speed and strength qualities. 80 to 89 is power. 90 to 99 is state of readiness. And 100 plus is test or peak. Okay, so I know what's happening with certain percentages on the bar physiologically. It's giving me feedback. If I'm in that zone here and that bar's going up like this, that's not speed strength. So I know they're out of their zone. I want that bar flying. It's like a boxer. That's the punch. It's not, you're not pushing. So where do I spend most of my time is here. We'll get here. I test 2 times a year, basically. When I'm getting ready to test, we'll dabble in that. But now you could look at average intensity. You can look at tonnage, okay, or you can look at peak intensity. So if I do a set at 70, 75, and 80, my average is this, although I touched on this. Does that make sense? So when I touch on this, I'm prepping them for that next phase. But my average of the day would have been in there. The other thing I look at too is this, and I think this is important. If I do 4 sets of 10, how many reps did I do? 4. If I do 8 sets of 5, how many did I do? 4. If I do 5 sets of 8, 4. If I do 20 sets of 2, 4. All of them are going to give a different response. Which one applies to football probably the most?
Around 50 sets of 2, Coach Reeve.
20 sets of 2.
50 sets of 2.
In this example, right? I could do 2 reps in 5 seconds. I'm not saying you have to be at 100 or 90%. You can do sets of 2 or sets of 3 in 5 seconds and get back in the rack every 30, right? We know optimally 3 to 5 minutes after a set, you get all your ATP back, right? But even in an Olympic weightlifting meet, that might not happen if you're following yourself based on the progressions. And if I'm playing football and I gotta get out there every 40 seconds, that play clock, and I'm playing a spread team, you gotta push them a little bit. Now we get up in here, I'm not gonna worry about that as much, but in the 70s, I can shorten the rest period a little bit. Because what's the difference between endurance and power? Excuse me, endurance and stamina. Endurance is long, slow, and steady. Stamina is repeated power over and over a significant amount of time. That's power. Repeated bouts of explosiveness over time with some recovery built in. Make some sense? It does to me. I think the other thing that's happening in today's world is this. I think we're failing in some ways. I'm not saying everybody, but I think it's hard. I don't know that today there's plans written to get from point A to point B over a period of time.
Like how long, Coach Reed?
Well, if it's an 8-week off-season program, point A to point B, you got 8 weeks. But what you'll see today is, well, I'm going to do this for a couple weeks. I'm going to do velocity-based, and I'm going to go to this, and then I'm going to go to this. Well, what's the consistency to get from point A to point B? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
You know, and you go back to some of the models. So whenever I design programs, I start with visual. So I'll start, you familiar with Tudor Bompa's stuff? Some of that? Okay, so you're getting this on top, but you're getting a steady climb underneath. So when I'm plugging my percentages in, where I want to have them at certain weeks. So if I go here, I'm at 70, and I go here, say I'm at 75, and I don't think they're ready to go up, I can stay at 75 the next week. So now I'm still at 75. Then I can take them to 80 if I feel they're good there. And again, I'm always using that 4 to 6 weeks time frame to see where physiological adaptations are. For me, one of the hardest things over my career was marrying the marriage of change and adaptation. And there's too much change, you never adapt, and if you stay in something too long, you get stale, and you kind of start to detrain a little bit. So how do you keep that recurring stimulus going? You either change the exercises, where now I feel like you're becoming a jack of all trades and a master of none, or you change the volume and intensity as you go. If you don't want to get into all the fancy calculations, another idea is this. If it's a strength movement, you want a minimum of 12 reps, and you don't want to go over 38 in a given day. So here's your floor, here's your ceiling. If it's a power movement, 12 to about 28. There's your floor and ceiling there. So if your reps fall within these two at a certain percentage, wherever you decide to count, you're usually pretty safe there. And I'm saying this now because that's kind of when they get out of that remodeling phase of rehab, and now they're starting to be freed up a little bit more and more in the weight room, so we don't get that chronic swelling or that effusion. That serves you well. And if I'm adding this, so I go from straight-legged raises to quarter squats, well, if I start quarter squat, do I need to keep straight leg raises going? Or do I stick to a short arc quad? Again, I'm just throwing some stuff out there. These are all, in other words, you don't want to keep adding and never take anything out because it starts to overflow. So if you're putting something in, something's got to come out. And that's where that pie I talked about earlier. I think it looks like this, something like this. So here's 46,000 rehab reps, there's 33. There's healthy Olympic lifters. Well, the healthy ones are only doing this. Why are we doing this for the injured? Because we all know, most of us are football in here, everybody's got something wrong during the season. If you're soccer, something's wrong with those guys or girls. If you're basketball, something, oh, my tendonitis is hurting. It's always something. So, how do you protect them? How do you protect them? And I know you've got all the special exercises, the bands and all that stuff, but is that producing enough strength to protect you in the field of competition? I'm not saying that's bad as an accessory to some extent, but you've got to be strong. And I'm not talking powerlifting strong. You've got to be strong.
I know you said you were counting your squat reps. How do you take into account like your single leg work into that? Is that like
Well, that's right. That on the single leg days, I don't count as my squats, but that's when I'll do the quad ham ratio. So if I'm doing a single leg, I believe in training the whole body every day. I believe that because you use your whole body every day. So we're doing an Olympic movement, we're doing a strength movement every day. But on my single leg days, like if I'm going Monday, say it's a heavy squat, Tuesday's gonna be a lighter single leg, but I'll balance that. I'll get a hamstring in every day too. Because it's not just quad ham ratios that, in terms of strength, it's what are other factors, speed of eccentric loading. Okay, because that's when it pulls, and then you hit, oh! Okay, so am I eccentrically loading them at a speed? And that might be your running, that might be the running side of it. Because you're getting enough strength work in the weight room, so you gotta get speed of deceleration or speed of eccentric elongation of that muscle somewhere else. It might be your bounding runs. It might be stairs where you're bounding upstairs, where you're getting that hamstring to fire at a pretty fast rate. And it might be now they got the perch units. Do you guys have that stuff here? Okay, so you have some of that. We just got perch over there. I don't know how to work with the young guys do, so is that good? Is that the red block is bad, the blue block is good, and the yellow block is too late. So that's what I know right now. But as you can tell. So a lot of those things, and I know I'm kind of going like this, but my point in this whole discussion is if our primary goal is to see this athlete reach this goal, shouldn't we all work together? That's the biggest thing. And shouldn't we really take the time to understand the demand of this sport, whatever the sport is, okay? So we can train them most optimally to meet those demands of that sport. I never played soccer. I went to California when I was 21, and they had a water polo team. Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. There wasn't much water polo going on, I promise you that. So, how do you train a water polo person if you don't study the sport of water polo? Not the X's and O's, just the energy system demands of that sport, of soccer, of field hockey, of lacrosse. Why would you train a lacrosse goalie the same as a midi? You know what I mean? And we didn't have all that stuff back then. Now they are like Cornell's ice hockey. They got sensors on their skates and all that. We didn't have any of that back then. So I used to track receivers with pen and paper, 20 yard out. Okay, that's 20 yards, 10 yards out. That's 30. Oh, but there's 30 yards jogging back to the huddle. That's 60. And now I'm coming up with this whole study. So if we had the top, say we had 9 receivers, I'll just make up a number. And these were the top 5. This is back when there was still 2 practices a day. So everybody practices for 2, say a day or 2. And then he gets one period off. So, and then he's back in and he gets the afternoon off. And they're both back in, he gets the next morning off. and all of them are in, he gets the afternoon off. And it was mainly the top 5 we would rotate back then based on pens and papers, and we're just trying to keep them fresh. Because who are the ones that get the hamstrings? Receivers and DBs. Linemen don't get them. Linemen might get a little bit of a groin if it's a pulling. At Delaware, we ran the wing tee. It was a lot of changing, a lot of this. Had to train those groins. So that's kind of the things we're looking at when you piece all this together, and it takes a little thought. I don't think it has to be rocket science, because I'm going to tell you this riddle, and it's stuck with me for 30-some years. I went up to New England in '93 to spend a week with Coach Barker when he was up there. So I've been to New England like 3 times. I've been down to his house in Tampa a couple times. But anyway, I get up to New England, '93, and he goes, I'm going to ask you a riddle. And I said, what's that, Coach? He goes, inch wide, mile deep. He goes, you got the whole week to figure it out. So I'm writing notes, get back to the hotel room, I would rewrite them real neat, because I'm just scribbling. So it's Friday, and I'm getting ready to leave, so I thank Coach Parcells. Thanks for having me, and Coach Parkus. And I was in the weight room from 5:30 in the morning till 7 at night every day. That was my spring break. And I'm thinking the whole time, I'm going, don't ask me about this riddle, because I couldn't figure it out. So I'm getting ready to walk out the door. He goes, oh, Coach, before you go, come here. I said, what's that, Coach? He goes, did you ever figure the riddle out? I said, no. He was inch wide. What? The little that works, and then do that a lot. So I'm driving back, it's about a 7-hour drive, and I'm just thinking of, run the play again, run the play. It's basically repetition and practice. So I kind of, since then, the only squatting we do is back squat. I don't do a million versions of squats. We'll front squat in our warm-ups for clean catching, but our lifting, those squat reps are strictly for back squat. I strictly hang clean. I don't pull from the floor. We'll do pulls from blocks, but in terms of actual cleans, it's strictly hang cleans. And I only clean them once a week because of the wear and tear. Now we're snatch pulling one day, we're snatching one day, we're clean pulling one day, and we're actually cleaning one day. So we're getting that in daily. Okay, but that triple extension, I'm getting all 4 days to try and get better at it. And I'm not pulling at a million different heights. I'm pulling at certain heights. My pulls are from here, my hangs are from here, and that's what we're doing. And it's served me well. And I don't like to throw stuff out there, but I am going to throw this out there. When I left Delaware, now this is Delaware. Back then we were 1AA. Now there's own Conference USA. But back then I still call it 1AA. When I left Delaware, we had 13 guys on our team that can hang clean over 400 at Delaware. And when I left to go to Virginia, the best clean they ever had there was 380. And we were only at Delaware cleaning once a week. But we were pulling and snatching and heavy RDLs. And so I go back to that inch wide and mile deep. Same thing with rehab, or progressions back. Okay, if I'm coming back from an ACL and I could walk, why can't we teach an A walk? A low A into a high A. It's a walk, but teach the mechanic, and then progress them to the A march, and then progress them to the low skip, progress them back to the high skip. And then you work with your PT, because how many trainers in PT, I know when I was an athletic trainer, and Paul, speaking on behalf here, you went through, and were you an athletic trainer too? Did you have your hand up? Okay. But did we learn A skips, A marches, all that in ATC school? No, you don't. Well, let me show you what an A march is, and you tell me if they can or can't do this. Because what you'll get is, no, they can't do that. Well, what is it? Well, I don't know. Well, how do you know then they can't do that? Just like, why are you doing this in rehab? Explain to me why you're doing this at this time so I can make my adaptations in the weight room when I see this kid. So to me, a lot of this comes together regardless. But when you're bridging that gap, because at some point, they've got to release them. And then now it's our job to get them back to their pre-injured state. That's when they're ready to return to play. And I know at some times, you gotta go today. But you never want to put them out there when they're still at risk and they can't defend or protect themselves. That's huge. So working together with that, now I look at some of these staffs that are out there. You got strength staffs, you got sports science staffs, you've got soft tissue staffs, you've got nutrition staffs, and a lot of them now are reconditioning staffs to bridge that gap.
Coach,
Yes.
question. When you're talking, like kind of explaining about why the guys at Delaware had the big cleans, you think it's because I'm not sure of the point, is it because of the contributing of the heavy RDLs, the heavy snatch pulls, and just doing it one time a week and really getting into it versus?
Well, to me it was more, we were very consistent in how we were cleaning.
Oh, just hang,
Yeah.
not all these other.
Right. So I didn't go from the floor one day, and here's what happened, and I'll tell you this, true story. I initially, so let me go back in time. So I initially did cleans from the floor at Delaware.
How come?
And, I just got USA certified with Leo and all that stuff, and, again, smarter than you think. So yeah, we're gonna clean from the floor. Yeah, that looks good, that, and the one day, I don't know what made me do it, I videoed one of our kids, Sean, and I videoed from the side, and here's what I wasn't seeing. Right before liftoff, they would push down,
Yes.
elbows would bend, and then and I wasn't catching that.
It's like a
Yeah, and I wasn't catching that. So then I strictly went to, are you familiar with the 4 starts of Olympic lifting? So there's your dynamic starts. Well, you got your static start. Okay, and then you got your hip, high to low to high, you're oscillating, but then you got the dive start. So I'm here, I'm dive starting and going. And that's strictly when I started to teach, and then I stuck to that. Let's just do this and get good at this. Now the other thing I'll say, because I didn't teach hook gripping because it's so uncomfortable, we clean with straps. And I know people say, well, the clean to me is to develop power. I want them handling weight. I can get grip strength, nothing else in the weight room is using straps, so we'll get grip strength. I'll add grips in, all that, but when we're pulling, it's straps. And you probably get about 20 pounds from that, you know what I mean? Just like a hook grip.
You gotta do them loose so you can catch it.
Well, you get them around the bar, but you leave a little bit of a little slack right there so they can turn. And if they catch like this, I'm okay with that.
Right, the world is not gonna end.
There's no perfect lifter, or else none of us would have jobs.
That's right.
So just don't get them killed, you know what I mean? And that's just my thinking, right or wrong. I mean, that's how I feel. If I'm doing cleans to develop grip strength and compromising power output, to me, I'm doing it for the wrong reason.
The heavy RDL, sometimes I look at the psychology of the athlete. Sometimes I feel like the RDL really hits their lower back, almost like I don't wanna say too much, that's not, but too much for them emotionally.
Well,
They're like, man, my back is getting worse.
Well, let me say this, you don't just slap them to that percentage, you've got to progress them over time.
Yes.
Like I initially will start our young guys, I want their goal to be a certain percent of their hang plane. Once they can get to that, then I want it to a certain percent, like let's get their RDLs to 80% of their back squat, and then once they can, then, but we're doing a ton of hypers, we're doing a ton of reverse hypers, like I'm crushing that posterior chain pretty good.
Yeah, what do you guys have, that donkey, whatever, the dual glute ham reverse hyper?
It's a glute ham, reverse hyper, and you can also take a thing out and you can work the legs independently too, which will help protect some of the SI
Who
issues.
makes that one? Powerlift?
I don't know, whoever the equipment, I think it's power.
Powerlift
Is it?
does it.
Okay. So, first time I've seen one of those, this is, let's get these, because I used to do it with bands. So, I mean, that's kind of how we do it, or how I think in this process. I know it's not to say, how do I want to say this? It's not, I know I bring some of the stuff. So think about this. I'll put it this way. If I have a back injury, part of my rehab is going to be, you know, your bird dog progressions. Part of my rehab might be some planking. Part of my rehab might be some hypers or reverse. Well, why not get the back strong and maybe not get a back injury? So if you take some of those concepts of rehab and you build them into your program as either warm up or cool down, I start every lift with something for the low back and I end every lift with something for the low back. And everything else falls in between.
Have you found though, with all the like specialists in under the, you know, performance director, this, that, like that, the training can sometimes they almost like, I don't know, push on things to be too conservative, just doesn't prepare them.
Some do, but I think that's where the communication comes in, where you gotta explain. I mean, you know, I go out and watch practice and games and all that stuff. I mean, it's not for the weak and timid.
Yep.
You know, and I like to say you get guys that play football, but then you have football players. They're two different people. You know, this guy's on the team, but this guy's a football player. But you gotta, it's like they say in boxing, why do you spar? You gotta tan the leather. I'm a big boxing fan, so. In fact, the last time I was in New York, I got to see Felix Trinidad fight Roy Jones Jr. Okay, I've seen Mayweather fight live. I've seen Arturo Gatti fight live. Alexis Arguello back in the early '80s. But you got to tan the leather, so you've got to prep them for that.
Yeah.
And that's why, you know, people, well, the benefit of the lift is the pull. Well, that's the triple extension benefit. But the benefit of the catch is shock absorption and triple flexion. The eccentric ability to stick that weight.
Yep.
So now if someone just pulls, that's their philosophy. I'm just trying to say stuff that I think has helped me throughout my career in minimizing, you know, I talked about those guys that cleaned at Delaware. You know what I'm most proud of is the list of guys that never missed a game, or that's what I'm most proud of. You know, I look at some of my Virginia guys that got first round picks and never missed a college football game.
How come, what was like, are you seeing more kids missing today?
No, I'm just saying, what's the greatest ability? Availability.